right, I think we're ready to continue our discussion of kind of our final life stage of human development. It's hard to imagine that we're already at that point of the semester. Dr. Fisher was with us last time and I think gave us a wonderful kind of introduction into late adulthood, kind of some insights in terms of some of our own personal kinds of views, as well as society's views, not only to older adults, but to the aging process itself. And we want to continue that today. I think one of the things that's helpful is that we each kind of, as we begin to talk about and look at more specifically the developmental domains of late adulthood, that we kind of have a mental picture in our minds of an older adult. Who is it in your life that you know fairly well, that you maybe have some somewhat regular contact with, that would fall into the category of late adulthood? Is there someone that you can kind of have a mental kind of picture of as we talk about this particular stage? In my own life, I have my grandmother just turned, just last week, 93, and she has lived in just a reference point, because I'll make some comments off and on about her and some of her own development during this stage, but has lived with my mom and dad for the past 30 plus years. She moved into our household when I was in junior high. And so, I've had, particularly during the time of growing up through my junior high and high school years, have had some pretty regular contact. And so have a reference point for really watching and seeing her kind of development through much of later adulthood. Like I said, I remember very visibly when she retired, in her mid-60s. And again, as I said, she just turned 93. And my mother is 72. So there are two adults in my life that I see weekly, virtually weekly, that I have some contact with and kind of a reference point. As I've mentioned a couple of times previously, a little over a year ago, I lost my dad at the age of 71. I have some minimal contact, but not on a regular basis, with my in-laws, who also are in the stage of late adulthood. So who's your reference point as we kind of think about and talk about late adulthood? Anyone that you kind of see on a regular basis that would be in this stage of late adulthood? What age? We're going to go look at it specifically, but typically we think of 65 and above, and we're going to kind of break that down. And for most people, a lot of times, it often is a grandparent, but many of you may have grandparents that are actually still younger than 65. He would be at the very beginning of that stage. Anyone else? Kind of just a reference point.
I have my grandma, but I also have my aunt who's moving into late adulthood.
Okay.
65.
Okay, so she's moving just into it, kind of on that transition point. 65, and then your grandmother would be.
She's 85.
Okay, 85. 80, in the mid 80s. Okay. Anyone else? Kind of someone that you know fairly well that would be in this stage. Anyone? In what age? In our 80s. Okay. So most of you probably have grandparents that are again, in the early 80s, someplace in that particular place. And again, like I said, it's kind of helpful to have kind of a reference point as we think about this stage, and when you think about what they're able to do and what's changed, what's not changed over the year, that you have some reference point. I ran across this quote, some time ago, and I just really liked it. Satchel Paige was a baseball player. You don't need to know that for the test, but made a statement: how old would you be if you didn't know how old you was? And I think it's kind of a characteristic of the late adulthoods, in the sense that, and I personally believe that to a lot of extent, late adulthood and our experience of the later years has a lot to do with how we image it and what our perspective was. And there are a lot of people who chronologically may appear to be a lot older than their attitudes and their activity levels and some of those kinds of things. And I notice it in myself, and clearly I'm a ways away from, hopefully, from late adulthood, very much aware of that the aging process has a lot to do with just your image of that experience, and how you feel about getting older. Just looking at kind of an overview, simply to be aware of that aging is a natural process. It's a natural slowing down process, as was indicated the other day. It is that which we're all going to experience. How we experience the aging process will vary from individual to individual, but it is a natural part of human development. In part, it's related to the loss and changes within the nervous system and the loss of neurons. And again, as you remember, when we go back to the very beginning of the semester, when we looked at prenatal development and began to look at the early stages of infant development, and we talked about brain development, realizing that when we talked about the connections of neurons through the synapses, that controls everything that happens, And so one of the things that we find as a result of the aging process is that over time we begin to lose some of those neurons. The efficiency of which messages are sent between neurons changes, and that has an effect on how efficiently our body functions. And it has an effect on how well organs function in our lives. And there are natural changes that are going to take place in all of us as a result of neurological changes that are taking place. And it is a part of the aging experience. When you think about the older adults that you know, and if you were to ask them to describe their overall health in relationship to how you would describe them, what do you think most of them would say? How do you think most older adults report? And again, pretty wide age range. We looked at someone who is just kind of moving into 65, someone who's up into mid-85s. My grandmother is 93, quite an age span in there. But how do you think most older adults see their overall health? And how would you describe the health of the older adults that you've identified? Okay, excellent. Some would probably talk about that it could be better. Again, depending upon the age and where they're at in their experience. What we really find is that most older adults report being in good general health. And again, it is going to depend upon a number of factors. But again, most talk about, they could talk about, well, I wish I had a little bit more energy and some of those kinds of things. Tired out maybe a little bit faster, again, depending upon the age of the individual. But most really talk about being in pretty good health. And the term that you will frequently hear, and I think understandably, is they'll make a statement, well, I'm in pretty good health for my age. And again, I think it is a pretty good perspective. I have always been amazed, and I look at my grandmother, like I said, who's 93. And clearly, in the last 5 to 8 years, she's experienced much more health-related problems and issues than she did when she was 65. But I still look at her overall health, and clearly she is sick more often. Sometimes it seems like she's more sick than not sick. But then I also put in perspective the fact that she's 93. And over Thanksgiving, weekend, she was up and move and active, and she still paints at the age of 93, And so for her age, by golly, she's doing pretty good. And I have to remind my mom of that sometimes, when you think about her age, she's in pretty darn good health, near the extent that she was when she was 65. And again, when you look at some of the ones that you've identified in terms of 65 or even 80, for the most part, they're able to do most of the things that they want to do. They're not greatly limited unless they're dealing with some more serious kinds of chronic illnesses or disease. Older adults can do most of what younger people can do. They simply tend to do it slower. And that's one of the defining, distinctions. And again, I think it's important to keep it in perspective, in terms of the age. And you can't make direct correlations between older adults and what they're able to do in relationship to, say, someone who's 25 or 30. But again, life is not overly limited during much of later adulthood. They do experience more chronic disease as they get older. I think what's important to keep in mind is, and we've mentioned this before when we were actually talking about young adulthood, is that most problems of the elderly did not begin in old age. They are a continuation and accumulation of lifestyle and choices that were made much earlier in life. And those choices and the decisions are going to impact the quality of life during this later stage. Anybody think of, when you think about the older adults that you know, maybe some of the chronic issues that they are dealing with at this stage in their life that was not as apparent when they were younger? And again, one of the things that we'll discover is that clearly heart-related issues are the most common, and my grandmother does. Interesting enough, it's not. My mother has a number of illnesses that she struggles with, but heart is not one of them at this point. But most of the things that she battles with are related to health-related issues much earlier in life. That's just an accumulation of that, and she has had some battles at times with cancer, which again are characteristic of what tends to happen in middle adulthood. Anyone else in terms of chronic illnesses or conditions that older adults that you know of are maybe addressing or dealing with? Alzheimer's, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Anyone else? What's that? Diabetes would also be fairly common again in the later years. It may have started again in some cases in middle adulthood, but clearly a chronic illness that you're basically going to contend with the rest of your life to a certain extent. So again, most of the problems in the elderly did not begin in old age. Again, this continues to shift and change, and you'll read more about it in your text. Average life expectancy is around, and they got of instead of for, but it's around 74 for men and about 80 for women. And again, remember when you're looking at averages, clearly you have a significant number of older adults over the age of 80, and more are living into their 90s and approaching 100 than clearly have in the past. But it's offset by those whose life is prematurely ended as a result of illness, diseases, accidents, those kinds of experiences. So again, we continue to see life expectancy increase. And again, as I know most of you are aware of, average life expectancy, at every stage of life tends to be higher for women than it is for men for a variety of reasons. When we look at classification, again, simply as life expectancy continues to increase, it's probably important that what we do is we tend to kind of break it into three categories. We have what's often referred to as the young old, and that's the group that's between 65 and 74. And again, compared to past generations, the young old tend to be in a very good physical health and mental health as well. And again, this tends to mark the period when, again, adults are verging on or moving into retirement years. We have then what's referred to as the old, that group between 75 and 84. And that kind of fits into that category that many of you have identified the person that you're familiar with. And then we have what's referred to as the oldest old, and that's those that are 85 and over, which represents the fastest growing segment of our society. And I think we're going to continue to see as technology improves, and I think as preceding generations really are more health conscious, I think we're going to continue to see people not only live longer, but live with higher quality of life longer than what we have seen in the past. And most of us know someone, again, who's 85 or over, and again, who are very likely going to make it into their or approaching 90. So again, exceeding that average life expectancy. I think one of the things that happens when we talk about late adulthood is that when we tend to think about older adults, which of these groups do we tend to think about? Particularly when we think about some of the more negative stereotypes that we talked about the other day. The oldest old. I think we tend to think about and we tend to characterize older adults, with that group that's 85 and old or over, or particularly those that are 90 and plus. And so we think about late adulthood, we think about that group. And we fail to realize that those that are 65 to 85 also are part of late adulthood. And many of those will not be characteristic of the images that we tend to have of those that are much in that oldest old group. And again, clearly, as people begin to approach 90, they're going to have slowed down. They're going to experience higher incidences of illnesses and chronic disease, and they're going to be limited in activity level compared to those that are 65. But we've got to keep in mind that we're talking about that whole age range of 65 and beyond, and so that we spend a significant amount of time in the later years in those first 20 years compared to possibly the last 10 and on the outside 15 years. And so again, we don't want to always have this image of the oldest old. One of the terms that's come up, and I really do like this, is really to think about late adulthood, not so much in terms of chronological age, but to think about it more in terms of functional age. And that's where we really classify or think about older adults in terms of their physical, emotional health, and their activity level. And what I mean by that is clearly, and I have known, and I'm sure some of you have known, someone who was in that oldest old group, or even in the later part of old chronological age group, that actually demonstrated activity levels in physical and emotional health that was even much better than some who may have been 65. Can you think of someone who is in the oldest old group, 85 or older? And can you think of someone that you know or have some reference to that clearly doesn't tend to exemplify the oldest old stereotype, that in terms of activity level or health and some of the things they're doing would be characteristic of someone much younger chronologically? And what is it that you've noticed about what they're doing to kind of capture that?
I had this guy a couple years ago when I was a lifeguard. He's really old. Every morning he would swim for like 2 hours, non-stop laps. I couldn't even do that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we see is someone like, and he would have been how old?
I don't know. He looked
He was probably above 85, or pretty close to it. And here's someone who literally is capable of outswimming someone who is much, much younger. And like you said, and that would be true for me, would outswim me at any probably point in my life. I'm amazed at the adults that are in late adulthood that do the marathon running. I could never run a marathon. I don't have a whole lot of desire to either. But again, who's in that kind of physical condition. I saw a video one time about someone again who was in the oldest old group that actually was still doing rock climbing. And again, it's hard for me to imagine someone doing that level of activity. But I remember both my parents, but also my grandmother, first snow skied when she was over the age of 65. And again, my grandmother, like I said, who's 93, up until really the last 8 or 10 years in terms of her activity level, has always been someone who's exemplified not only activity level, but physical health of someone who is much younger. And my mother, really, in her early stages of late adulthood, have had a lot more physical health problems than my grandmother ever did at her age at that time. Anyone else think of someone who's in that oldest old group that, really is characteristic of someone activity level or health much, much younger?
My great-aunt Ellen, she travels all over the place. She goes to wine tasting and gambling. I think she went to China a couple years ago.
And she would be
85.
85. So, up in there. And again, someone who's still very active, going strong, traveling, wine tasting. And again, it's not uncharacteristic for someone to be in that kind of health and condition and to do those things, again, when they've got the freedom and the flexibility and many times the financial resources to do it. Again, when my grandmother was, again, in her 80s, was like your aunt, traveling, because she really was fascinated with her roots. And so she went to Germany and some other places to track down the ancestors, and she's put together this massive portfolio of our family history. And she did all of that in the later years. And again, a lot of the traveling. Yeah. Again, 95-year-old grandmother who still at 95, still Christmas dinner, still functioning as she probably did for the last who knows how many years. And again, again, that importance of staying independent and being in control of things in their lives. And again, that's amazing. And she evidently still lives by herself.
Does her cattle every morning.
Does her cattle every morning? I had an uncle who was 86 that was that way, because I remember spending the summer with him on his farm out in the Panhandle. And again, same kind of thing. Get up every morning, do the things on. And I mean, again, he didn't farm to the extent he did when he was much younger, but still had the cattle, still took care of the cows. Up early in the morning, going, and in many ways felt like he could outdo me in terms of, again, the ability to keep on going. At 95, that's amazing. And again, very much more characteristic of someone who is more like 65 or 70 than someone who is 95. So again, I think probably what's more meaningful really is to think about age in terms of the functional age, not so much how old I am, but what am I capable of doing? What are my physical abilities, my mental abilities, my emotional state, and my activity level is probably a better way of understanding, the aging process. As we've done with each stage, we're not going to say a lot about these because we'll address them as we move through the rest of our discussion. But as we look at developmental tasks of late adulthood, clearly there is the adjusting to decreasing strength and health. It is a natural part, again, of the aging process. Health, to some extent, is going to decline. The extent that it declines, as we've said numerous times, has to do with choices that we have made and that we continue to make at this stage. Again, for those that have remained active, who have been really conscious about health-related issues in terms of exercise, dieting, sleep, healthy mental attitudes, those declines are going to be less than someone else that's not been their experience. Tend to what we think of late adulthood, and again, this is changing to some extent, and we'll talk more about it later on when we talk a little bit about retirement, but it's adjusting to retirement. We typically think of retirement age, and again, with Social Security shifting, that's changing a little bit. We used to think of people generally retiring about the age of 65, which marked kind of that transition into the later years. And clearly, it is one of the adjustment issues. How well do I make that successful transition into having worked, particularly for those that have worked a significant part of their lives, some very well 40, 45 years or even longer, making that adjustment into a non-work situation or at least reduced work situation. For some, it may also mean a reduction in income. And again, not only adjusting to retirement, but to a shift in economic status as well. Though, again, as we'll talk about later on, that's not near to the extent that it has been for those in the past, as I think we tend to be much more prepared for economically for the later years. Again, we'll talk about this at the very end of the semester, but clearly one of the experiences that older adults deal with is the death of a spouse. And again, adjusting to the loss of a relationship in many cases, that may extend 30, 40, and in some cases even 50 years. Someone who's been a significant part of their lives on a daily basis, and making that adjustment to that loss. Again, when we talk about social development, we'll talk about changing relationships, but again, the significance of developing friendships during late adulthood, particularly as we lose family members, friendships become significantly important, and then establishing new relationships as we may lose friends within our same age group. And we'll talk more about the significance of that. Again, meeting social and civic obligations has been a developmental task all along through adulthood, but one of the things that we do find is that with retirement and older adults having more time may take on different roles within the community. And so it's not uncommon to find older adults to be involved in volunteer work, be that at hospitals, libraries, volunteer work with nonprofit organizations. I've known of several who have gotten real involved in fundraising for nonprofits, again, because it fits some of their expertise, but also because they had the time to commit to something that can be really time-consuming. I've seen within my own family older adults who have always been real involved in church, even more involved, again, during this stage, particularly within retirement, because they have the freedom and different time to invest. In that, as well as involved in schools in different kinds of ways. And we're seeing more and more older adults who are going into even elementary schools and, helping out and volunteering and reading to children, involved in special projects and activities and mentoring children, those kinds of things. So again, increased activities in social organizations. And likewise, another developmental task is establishing satisfactory living quarters, which for many adults mean at least transitioning or adjusting their living situations. I know that in the case of my in-laws just recently, because of my father-in-law's declining health and some other factors, over the Thanksgiving break had made some very intentional decisions about how they were going to make some adjustments to their living situation. They weren't going to change houses necessarily, but they were simplifying. And one of the things that you find a lot of times is families will begin to simplify. And one of the things that they had made a decision of was that all the outside work was going to be, done by somebody else. And that's one of the things that you often find, particularly in situations with older adults that maybe have a fairly large house or have a fairly large yard, and to get to the point where they just simply don't feel capable or don't have a desire to manage it any longer, making those kinds of adjustments. We've seen, not a trend, but more and more older adults that actually have made decisions to sell or move out of large houses with large yards in kind of a movement towards condominiums or townhomes, where they don't have responsibility for outside work or maintenance of the exterior of their complex. And again, a way to kind of simplify life. Again, in terms of older adults that you're aware of, any changes in ways that they've adjusted to living quarters. Now, ironically, sometimes you see the reverse to where they actually, and I've seen many older adults, particularly down in the area where our retirement home is, actually adding to and changing their homes. And in some of these are actually their permanent homes. In some cases, they are second homes. But it's been amazing to me how many have done major renovations and major additions to the space, rather than cutting back, adding to. Again, it's not uncommon for older adults sometimes to move out of larger houses into something smaller that they feel more manageable. But to do that short notice without any preparation could be problematic, to say the least. Anyone else changes that they're aware of an older adult, might have made, again, to simplify life? Because it is part of one of the developmental tasks often, and particularly as they move up through, the stages of late adulthood. Access to local transportation. For some, it may be greater accessibility to health services, those kinds of things. Again, people often will make some changes and some adjustments for a variety of different reasons. Some of these were brought out, and again, we're not going to say a lot about these at this point, but looking at some of the common myths of late adulthood, because most of these I think we're going to address as we move through our discussion, and hopefully we'll dispel a lot of these. Again, I think with any myth or any stereotype, they tend to exist because in some cases they do tend to be true. But the case is whether they tend to be true for the age group as a whole or not, and I think that's what makes them a myth. Within isolated pockets within an age group, some of these myths may actually tend to be somewhat characteristic. They do, I think, tend to exist, and it's what we tend to think about late adulthood, and they may be more characteristic, again, of that oldest, the final phase of late adulthood, rather than what most of late adulthood is. A lot of times we think of older adults, and we tend to think of nursing homes and nursing facilities. And so we tend to think of that's where most adults will ultimately end up. And clearly that's not true. Even within the oldest old group, only about 25% will ever spend any time in a nursing facility. The vast majority will live on their own for the majority of their late adulthood years, or with a family member, in many cases a spouse, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. With the loss of a spouse, many will continue to live independently on their own, and that's their desire. And even in the later years, may live brief periods of time, maybe with another family member or with other kinds of support services. But it's a small percentage of the whole group that actually spends time in a nursing institution. Again, are usually tired and spend most of their time in bed. Again, that tends to be one of the stereotypes. And I'm sure all of us know someone where that appears to be characteristic. Clearly, as I look at my grandmother, she has spent a lot more time being tired, a lot more time sleeping, and a lot more time in bed in recent years. But when you look over the course of her life, that would not be characteristic. When my dad was living, even after retirement, he was still up at 5 or 5:30 in the morning, And at 5:30 in the morning, he would walk 2 miles every morning. And he did that right up until the point that he became sick. And it seems almost like it was the week before that he was doing his typical 2-mile walk when he then became, chronically ill. Again, we think of, the older adults that, and my dad and others that I've known would take that, kind of typical afternoon, nap. But again, spending most of the time in bed sleeping and tired really isn't characteristic of late adulthood as a group. And a lot of that, I think, is related, again, to health-related kinds of issues, and in some cases even medication that may impact, sleepiness. Reality is that later adults tend to have more difficulty sleeping, have more difficulty staying asleep. So again, the notion that they sleep a lot is not necessarily characteristic of the group as a whole. Are prone to illness and accidents. Again, as we've already indicated, chronic illness does increase during later adulthood. Again, we think of the oldest old, and we think of older adults who have fallen, or who have had accidents. But again, that doesn't tend to be characteristic of the group as a whole, and doesn't occur on a regular kind of basis. Are they more ill than when they were young adults? Yes. But again, in comparison to their age and this point in their lives, they're not as prone to that as we may often image or think. Can neither remember or learn. Again, a little bit later on, we won't say much at this point. We'll talk a little bit about changes in memory, and we'll talk some about learning. But the bottom line is older adults are more than capable of continuing to learn, and many are engaged in activities of learning new skills and gaining new knowledge about a variety of things. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later on. Again, one of the common myths about older adulthood is that they are not sexually active and they have no interest in sex. I remember, and we're not going to talk a lot about that in here, but I'll never forget, I was teaching this course a number of years ago, and we were talking about sexual activity with older adults, and one student couldn't handle it. The thought of her grandmother having any interest in sex just blew her away. And just the image going through her mind just was really troubling to her. And I think that does tend, a lot of times we have trouble thinking about older adults. But talk to anyone who's worked in a nursing facility. Sexual interest, sexual activity still tends to be, and I don't know if anyone in here has or not, but still very much a part of life. But, and if you talk to people who work in the field, will tell you that more and more facilities are actually having to deal with and make accommodations to address those issues and needs of older adults who no longer have partners, and that's still very much a part of their lives. And again, the important thing is to realize is that does it change? Is sexual activity diminished? Yeah, it is as a part of the aging. But to say that there's no interest and there is not sexual activity, and we know that the vast majority of older adults who date, are sexually active. So again, it's still very much a part of life. Again, one of the myths is we tend to think of stereotypically, and often I think this comes from our notion of, again, those older adults that are in different types of facilities, nursing facilities, who are there isolated away from family. Nobody ever comes to visit them. They're lonely. They're depressed. And clearly we know that there are some that is their experience of life, unfortunately. But it's not the case for the majority. The majority have regular contact with family members or with friends, and to some extent are socially involved and engaged. And that clearly is more of a stereotype that only represents a small segment of older adults. Spend most of their time watching TV. Now, maybe it's true that they spend more time watching TV than maybe they did at other stages of their lives. But again, I don't think it's characteristic of the group as a whole that they wake up. And again, we all probably know someone that does seem stereotypical and somewhat characteristic of, that wakes up in the morning, turns the TV on, sits there in front of that TV all day long until night, goes to sleep, does it over and over again, and that really isn't the pattern. I find with the older adults that I know that there clearly are their favorite shows that they do not miss. It's almost like a religion that they catch those shows. But the rest of their day isn't spent in front of the TV, but engaged in a variety of other activities. And finally, we often think of stereotypically the older adult who's grouchy, self-pitying, and cranky. And again, we know that there are some personality and emotional changes that take place, sometimes the result of medications that certain older adults will be on. But what do you think is the reality of the older adult that we stereotypically think is grouchy and cranky? Is it a part of the natural aging process?
I think it's a combination of all that you have up there, that they're isolated, they spend most of their time in bed, and on TV, and they're sick all the time.
And if that was their experience, most of this stage, then that probably would be the outcome, but it doesn't tend to be. And what we really find is that older adult that we tend to characterize as being grouchy and cranky, the reality is they probably have been grouchy and cranky most of their life. I had another grandmother passed away a number of years ago, and she was just very, very difficult. She just had a very kind of hard personality. She was not very approachable. She clearly fit the stereotype. She was grouchy. She was cranky most of the time. She tended to have a really negative attitude, but she was that way from day one that I can remember. You know, it wasn't something I think that came on in later adulthood as much as it was a part of her personality and how she looked at life, and clearly was not a part, you know, of the aging process. All right, looking at physical development, and again, we'll move through these fairly quickly. A lot of them is just simply to identify some of the physical changes that are taking place. Don't want to spend a lot of time. Physiological changes are highly variable. And again, I think that's one thing that's important to keep in mind. When we think of this age range, one between, say, 65 plus, you know, and particularly those that are over 90, we're going to see a lot of variations even within a chronological age group. You take a group of 100 individuals that are 65, and you're going to see a lot of variations within these common changes that we often take up. So again, think about it in terms of, again, very broad generalities, and looking at this group as a whole. Again, we've already talked about neurological changes and the loss of neurons. The greatest loss of neurons occur after the age of 60. But I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that they are still capable of experiencing new synapses. So even though we're losing neurons, there still is the capable of creating new connections between neurons that still exist. And so based on what we already know, what's that tell us? What's going to be critical for older adults, particularly 60 and over? Learn new things. Keep the mind active. Again, it's like what we talked about, if you remember back when we were talking about infancy in the early years, the way that you create synapses is sensory stimulation. So it's important for older adults to stimulate that whole range of senses. What happens, though, particularly for older adults that tend to have health problems, is rather than staying active, they become growingly inactive. And then that diminishes those synaptic activity. And then that will have more degenerative effects on every part of their functioning. So there are a loss of neurons, but again, remember, with stimulation, with activity, we can still create additional synapses. There's the aging of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Again, part of the changes in the neurological system itself creates some changes again in organ functioning. Again, as a natural part of that aging process. Again, many of you have already commented that a common complaint or issue for older adults are heart-related illnesses or diseases as well. We know that the heart doesn't pump as strongly. There's a decline in oxygen flow to body tissues. We also know that there tends to be a continuing kind of growing decrease in terms of the lungs' ability to fill up, you know, and empty. And so all those are going to have some effect. The extent of that will vary greatly between individual adults. But again, there's going to be some. But for the most part, again, those tend to be fairly gradual and, again, don't tend to affect daily functioning. My endurance, you know, my ability to keep going for long periods of time, that may be diminished some, but not greatly. We've already talked, again, when we were talking about middle adulthood, we talked about, you know, one of the areas where we do experience decline is in the area of vision. There's a continual decline. But again, for most older adults with glasses or contact lenses, most adults can see fairly well. As I mentioned when we were talking about middle adulthood, farsightedness usually stabilizes around the age of 60. But again, it's not uncommon. I remember and I don't know if my dad really ever had a pair of prescription glasses that I could think of. But I remember my mom gave me a whole box of reading glasses. And so he basically functioned simply with reading glasses. That was the only time he really needed the glasses, but for the rest of things that he did. And so he really never did the prescriptions. He just bought different powers of reading glasses, at Walmart, and that's pretty much how he addressed his vision issues. And I don't know that I recall him ever wearing them while driving or even at night, just basically for reading purposes. Again, these represent continuations that we've already mentioned. There is continued difficulty adjusting from bright to dim light. And so one of the common complaints you have of older adults, and I know I'm guilty and I'm sure others are guilty of being somewhat critical of older adults at night and their driving. But part of that's simply related to that, a difficulty adjusting from daylight to dim light. And so in order to be cautious and careful, they do have trouble again with night vision. Or particularly much more uncomfortable. I frequently hear elders say, I just don't like driving at night. It makes me really uncomfortable. I can't see really well. And again, that's just a continuation of what we saw back in middle adulthood, but again, considerably more difficult. Again, as we mentioned during middle adulthood, we still see a decline in sensitivity to glare. I think the other thing that probably was not as characteristic of middle adulthood is depth perception. And so, again, thinking of it in the context of, say, driving, what are some of the difficulties that older adults have in terms of depth perception? How far away the other cars are and how fast other cars are approaching. I think after my grandmother's second accident, not being able to adjust distances was finally when the car was taken away and the driver's license was basically put away as well. And again, simply that depth perception, just being able to adjust. And it's like it didn't seem like it was that close, but it was. And whether that's oncoming or traffic that's in front. And again, driving becomes one of the issues for older adults. And one of the real struggles when the opportunity to drive is finally taken away and the freedom that comes with that. Likewise, there's an increased risk of cataracts, with more than 50% of people over 65 developing them. Again, basically, it's a cloudy area in the lenses causing blurred vision. If untreated, can cause blindness, but again, with the technology we have today, is easily detected, easily taken care of. But it is something that older adults need to be aware of. And again, along with glaucoma, is something that eye doctors frequently check, particularly during the later adult stage of life. And again, we've already talked about decline in hearing, but through much of middle adulthood, most of those declines are compensated by simply turning up the volume. They're not things that affect daily functioning. Even up to the age of 74, we still only have about a third of people in the late adult stage, again, who have hearing loss that interferes with daily life. And even those that are 75 and older, it's only about 50%. So again, half of older adults don't experience hearing loss that again affects daily life. But again, there's a percentage that do. From the earliest time I can remember, again, my grandmother, not my mother. As far as I know, my mother's hearing is very good going into her 70s. But from as long as I can remember, when my grandmother moved in later adulthood, difficulty with hearing. To the point where she clearly needs a hearing aid. She got very, very good and is very good. If you're looking at her, she can read lips, very, very well. But if you're not looking at her and you're talking to her, she can't hear a word you're saying. And even to this day, she frequently will refuse to or won't wear her hearing aids. And this goes back even 20 years ago, even when she was in her 70s and needed the hearing aid. Often was very reluctant, even though she had them, and it made a difference when she was wearing them. Anyone in terms of their experience with older adults have struggled with hearing loss? And what is the impact, do you think, that has on older adults that you've known? Because I think one of the things that happens is it really does begin to affect relationships.
My grandma's hearing has been getting worse and worse for many years, but now it's so bad that she has a hearing aid, but she won't use it, and a real amplified, but she won't use that. She's kind of denying that she has problems, but it keeps her from interacting with people and being part of a conversation and being part of
more than one person, and they were only talking.
All right. Excellent. I mean, because I think you hit on a lot of points that I think are common for people who have, and it would have been the case for my grandmother as well. One, there's a real reluctance, even when they know they need hearing aids, and even when they have them, to use them. Because I think one of the real struggles is the admitting it's one of those real visible kinds of signs that I am getting older and that I'm losing some capabilities that I once had. And so the way to deny that is not to use them. But one of the things that happens, and twofold that was mentioned, is that when a lot of people are in a room, particularly without using the hearing aids, it all becomes overwhelming because the sounds all begin to run together. And what happens is when older adults refuse to wear the hearing aid, it impacts their ability to engage in regular conversation, And so it becomes frustrating for everyone. And what I have found in my own experience, and not only myself but even my son is exactly 80 years younger than my grandmother. And when he was really young, he didn't even understand or realize that it was funny if you watched him. He would go downstairs where my grandmother lived, and they would interact and carry on, and a lot of times be talking about two totally different things. But when my son got older and when he began to realize that she couldn't hear and understand him, he got really frustrated, and even to this day is more hesitant in limited interactions. And he'll say, well, she can't hear me, unless you're looking at her and having a conversation, and it does. It diminishes the interaction and contact, and it can have an effect kind of on the level of closeness, over time. But it is one of those struggles, in terms of accepting part of that reality of the hearing loss that can occur. But again, for a lot of older adults who accept that as a part of it and wear the hearing aids, it doesn't affect, again, daily functioning and can interact and converse with others, in a very normal, typical kind of fashion. All right, we'll pick up on this next time, and then also we'll look at some things that are happening in terms of mental changes.